The Kresh command ship hung in space like a massive metal mountain. It was called the Dominator, and it lived up to its name. Commander Zarnoth stood on the bridge watching his tactical displays with satisfaction. Around his flagship floated 10,400 warships. It was the largest battle group the Kresh Dominion had assembled in 50 years. Each ship carried enough firepower to level a city. Together, they could destroy entire worlds. Zarnoth was a veteran of 30 campaigns. He had conquered species that begged for mercy and species that fought to their last breath. The result was always the same. The Kresh won. They always won. That was the natural order of the universe. Strong species survived and weak species served or died. His tactical officer approached with the latest intelligence reports. The officer said that all human colonies had been located and mapped. There were 3 major settlements and 17 smaller outposts scattered across the outer rim. The human fleet numbered approximately 800 vessels total. Most of them were clustered around their main colony worlds, trying to form some kind of defensive line. Zarnoth's mandibles clicked together in what passed for Kresh laughter. 800 ships against 10,000. The humans were either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. Probably both. He had read the intelligence files on humanity. They were a young species barely a century into space travel. Their technology was adequate, but nothing special. They had faster-than-light drives and energy weapons like everyone else, but no technological advantages that would matter in a real fight. The commander gave orders to begin the final approach. His fleet would advance in 1 standard cycle, which was about 6 hours in human time measurement. They would sweep through the human territories in a massive wave. Any ships that resisted would be destroyed. Any colonies that refused to surrender would be bombarded from orbit. Survivors would be taken as slaves. It was the Kresh way, and it had worked for thousands of years. Zarnoth never gave that order because something impossible happened. Alarms started screaming across every Kresh ship at the same moment. The tactical displays lit up with thousands of new contacts. They appeared suddenly as if materializing from nowhere. The human fleet was supposed to be 6 light hours away near their colonies. Instead, they were right here emerging from behind a large asteroid field at 0.6 light speed. The tactical officer's claws scrambled over his controls. His voice was high with panic as he reported the numbers. 800 human ships had somehow crossed 6 light hours without being detected. Now they were accelerating directly toward the Kresh fleet. 0.7 light speed. 0.8. 0.9. Zarnoth felt his blood turn cold. No organic crew could survive those acceleration forces. The gravity would crush them into paste. But the human ships kept accelerating as if physics did not apply to them. His tactical officer said impact would occur in 45 seconds. What Zarnoth did not know was that human ships were built differently than anyone else's. The crew sections rotated inside the hull, creating artificial gravity that always pointed the same direction no matter how the ship maneuvered. While the ship pulled accelerations that would kill any unprotected being, the crews inside felt nothing but normal Earth gravity. It was a trick humans had perfected during their early space exploration, when they realized their bodies were not built for the stress of space travel. Captain Susan Blake stood on the command deck of the EDF Ranger. Her ship was accelerating at forces that should have liquefied her bones, but she felt like she was standing in a normal room on Earth. The rotating habitat section inside her ship compensated for everything. Her crew worked at their stations as calmly as if they were sitting still. Her weapons officer called out that all batteries were charged and ready. Firing solutions were locked on multiple targets. They had discussed this moment for weeks. Every captain in the fleet knew exactly what to do and when to do it. There was no confusion and no hesitation. Susan gave the order to fire. The Ranger, along with 400 other human warships, unleashed their weapons at the same instant. Railguns fired projectiles accelerated to incredible speeds by electromagnetic force. Each round carried the kinetic energy of a small nuclear weapon. The Kresh point defense systems were designed to intercept missiles and energy beams. They had no chance against solid projectiles moving at relativistic velocities. Zarnoth watched in horror as the front third of his fleet simply ceased to exist. Ships that had served the Dominion for centuries vanished in explosions of metal and atmosphere. The Dominator shuddered as several rounds impacted its shields. The shields held, but they were never designed to absorb this kind of punishment. His tactical officer reported that over 3,000 ships had been destroyed in the first 30 seconds of combat. Zarnoth screamed orders to return fire. The Kresh fleet opened up with everything they had: plasma cannons that could melt through armor, missile batteries that could overwhelm any defense, energy beams that could cut a ship in half. Thousands of weapons fired at once, creating a storm of destruction that filled space with deadly light. The weapons hit nothing but empty vacuum. The human ships were already gone. They had changed course with perfect coordination, and the Kresh fire passed through space where they had been milliseconds before. Zarnoth realized something terrifying. The humans were not reacting to his orders. They were predicting them. No, that was not quite right. They were moving as if they shared a single mind. There was no delay between observation and action, no gap between seeing a threat and responding to it. His tactical officer tried to explain what he was seeing, but the words did not make sense. The human ships moved like they were connected by instantaneous communication. Every vessel knew what every other vessel was doing at the exact same moment. It should not be possible. All communication had delay. Radio waves took time to cross space. Even the fastest quantum transmitters had some lag. But the humans seemed to have no lag at all. Admiral Greg Patterson commanded the human fleet from the EDF Valiant. He watched the battle unfold on his displays with grim satisfaction. The first pass had gone exactly as planned. 3,000 enemy ships destroyed with 0 human losses. Now came the hard part. The Kresh still had over 7,000 functional warships, and they would not fall for the same trick twice. He gave the order for Phase 2. The human fleet fragmented into dozens of smaller groups. Each group moved independently but with perfect coordination. They scattered across the battlefield, making it impossible for the Kresh to concentrate their fire. The enemy fleet was designed for overwhelming frontal assaults. They expected to face an enemy that would form a defensive line and try to hold position. Instead, the humans were everywhere at once. Captain Danny Torres pushed his ship, the EDF Hornets, through a series of loops and turns that would be impossible for any other species. His crew worked calmly in their rotating sections. His tactical officer, Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez, called out targets with mechanical precision. 3 destroyers were clustered together, trying to provide mutual support. Danny acknowledged and fired. The Hornets' railguns spoke, and the 3 destroyers came apart like toys. Before the Kresh could return fire, Danny had already moved to a new position. His ship danced through space following a pattern that seemed random, but was actually carefully calculated. Every human captain followed similar patterns. The result was chaos for the Kresh. They could not predict where the humans would be. They could not concentrate their forces effectively. Every time they tried to organize a response, the humans were already somewhere else. 2 hours into the battle, the numbers told a brutal story. The Kresh had lost 6,000 ships. Humanity had lost 15. Most of those 15 were from a single squadron that had been caught by a lucky missile barrage in the opening minutes. The rest of the human fleet continued their deadly work with cold efficiency. Zarnoth stared at his tactical displays and tried to understand how this was happening. His fleet was better armed. His ships were individually more powerful. His warriors had thousands of years of combat experience. None of it mattered because the humans could coordinate their actions with impossible precision. They moved like a school of fish or a flock of birds. Each individual acted independently, but they formed a greater whole that was far more than the sum of its parts. His tactical officer suggested forming a defensive sphere. If they clustered together, the humans would have to come to them. Maybe then they could bring their superior numbers to bear. Zarnoth agreed because he had no better ideas. He gave the orders and watched his fleet slowly form into a massive sphere bristling with weapons. The humans did not cooperate. They simply continued their hit-and-run attacks. They struck from unexpected angles and vanished before the Kresh could respond. The defensive sphere became a target-rich environment. Every ship on the outer edge of the formation was vulnerable, and the humans picked them off one by one with ruthless efficiency. Counselor Drath stood at the observation wall in the council chamber, watching the battle feed with his many eyes. He could not look away, even though what he was seeing should have been impossible. Other council members had gathered around him. Their various forms of communication created a buzz of shocked voices that filled the room. Some were whispering in disbelief. Others were arguing about what they were witnessing. All of them were trying to understand how the humans were doing this. The tactical display showed the battle in real time. Red icons represented Kresh ships and blue icons represented human vessels. 3 hours ago, the display had been almost entirely red with just a small cluster of blue. Now the red was scattered and fading. More than half the Kresh fleet was gone. The blue icons swarmed through space like angry insects hunting prey. Counselor Tresh floated closer to the display. Her jellyfish body pulsed with agitated colors inside her water bubble. She said this was impossible. Her species had fought the Kresh for 6 years. They had thrown everything they had at the enemy and barely destroyed 1,000 ships before their military collapsed. The humans had been fighting for 3 hours and had already destroyed over 6,000 Kresh vessels. Speaker Valen's crystalline form pulsed with colors that indicated profound confusion. His voice echoed through the chamber as he asked the question everyone was thinking. How were the humans doing this? Their technology was not superior to the Kresh. Their ships were not more powerful. Their weapons were comparable to what every other species used. So how were they winning so decisively? Drath pointed at a cluster of human ships executing a complex flanking maneuver. He said to watch how they moved. There was no delay between ships, no gap between decision and action. They moved like a single organism with many parts. One ship would start to turn and instantly all the other ships would adjust their positions to maintain the formation. It was coordination beyond anything any council species had achieved. Another counselor whose species resembled large armored crabs said that maybe the humans had some kind of hive mind. Perhaps they were not individuals at all but parts of a collective consciousness. That would explain the perfect coordination, but Velen dismissed this theory. The council had extensive files on human psychology and biology. They were definitely individuals with independent minds. There was no hive structure in their society. So if they were individuals, how were they coordinating so perfectly? The answer had to be in their communication technology. Every species used radio or similar electromagnetic signals to communicate between ships. Those signals traveled at light speed, which seemed fast but actually created delays over the vast distances of space. A command sent from a flagship might take seconds or even minutes to reach ships on the far side of a battle formation. Experienced commanders learned to compensate for this delay by predicting what their subordinates would need to do. But there was always some lag, always some gap between seeing a situation and responding to it. The humans seemed to have no gap at all. Drath said he had been watching carefully for 3 hours now. He had seen human ships react to threats before those threats should have been visible to them. He had seen formations shift and adapt in less time than it should take for a command to cross the distance between ships. The only explanation was that humans had somehow eliminated communication delay entirely. Back in the battle zone, things were getting worse for the Kresh. Commander, Zarnoth's defensive sphere strategy was failing. His ships clustered together for mutual protection, but that just made them easier targets. The humans did not charge into the sphere as he had hoped. Instead, they circled around it like predators around wounded prey. They picked off ships on the outer edge of the formation one by one. Captain Helen Price commanded the EDF Falcon. She watched the Kresh fleet trying to maintain their defensive formation and almost felt sorry for them. Their commanders were still thinking in terms of traditional naval warfare. They positioned their ships. They gave orders. They waited for those orders to be received and executed. By the time their ships responded to a command, the tactical situation had already changed. Her executive officer, Lieutenant Chris Morgan, pointed out a cluster of damaged Kresh cruisers that had fallen slightly behind the main formation. Helen acknowledged and adjusted course. The Falcon, along with 30 other human ships, converged on the target. They fired from multiple angles simultaneously. The Kresh cruisers never had a chance to return fire. They simply came apart under the concentrated barrage. Admiral Greg Patterson studied the overall tactical picture from his command center. The Kresh fleet was down to less than 3,000 functional ships. Many of those were damaged and barely combat capable. Human losses stood at 42 ships. Most of those losses came from the early phase of the battle when the Kresh had managed one lucky missile spread. Since then, the human fleet had adapted, and the casualty rate had dropped to almost nothing. Commander Lisa Monroe stood beside the Admiral, reviewing the damage reports. She said the Kresh were going to break soon. Their formation was barely holding together. Ships were starting to drift out of position. Some were trying to flee. The enemy fleet was on the edge of complete collapse. Greg nodded and made a decision. It was time to end this. He gave orders to all carriers in the fleet. They were to launch all fighters immediately. Hundreds of launch bays across dozens of human ships opened at the same instant. Small attack craft poured into space. They were even more agile than the larger warships, and their pilots were some of the best humanity had to offer. Lieutenant Jake Sullivan sat in the cockpit of his fighter called the Dagger. Around him, 50 other fighters from the Valiant formed up in tight formation. Their targeting systems were linked through the same quantum communication network that connected all human forces. Jake could see what every other pilot in his squadron saw. He knew where they were and what they were doing without anyone having to say a word. Squadron Leader Commander Patricia Wells gave the order to break by squadrons and engage at will. Jake selected a Kresh destroyer that was trailing atmosphere from earlier damage. He pushed his throttle forward and his fighter screamed across the distance in seconds. He unleashed a salvo of micro-missiles into the destroyer's engine section. The Kresh ship staggered and began tumbling through space, venting air and fuel. All across the battlefield, similar scenes played out. Human fighters swarmed around the remaining Kresh ships like piranhas around wounded prey. The Kresh had fighter craft of their own, but they could not match human maneuverability. Human pilots pulled turns that would kill pilots from any other species. Their rotating cockpits kept them in comfortable one gravity while their fighters pulled accelerations that should have been impossible. Zarnoth watched his tactical display and felt something he had never experienced before in 30 campaigns: fear, real gut-churning terror. His fleet was being destroyed, not just defeated but systematically dismantled. The humans were not fighting like any species he had ever faced. They fought with a coordination and precision that seemed almost mechanical. But there was nothing mechanical about their tactics. They were creative and unpredictable. They found weaknesses and exploited them before his officers could react. His tactical officer reported that they had lost 70% of the fleet. All forward elements were destroyed. The reserve squadrons were requesting permission to withdraw. That word hit Zarnoth like a physical blow. Withdraw, retreat, run away. The Kresh had not retreated from battle in 300 years. Their entire culture was built on the concept of victory through overwhelming force. They did not know how to retreat because they had never needed to. But what choice did he have now? Staying meant complete annihilation. Every minute that passed meant more ships destroyed. More warriors killed. The battle was lost. That reality was undeniable. The only question was whether to die here with his fleet or live to warn the Dominion about what they faced. Zarnoth made the hardest decision of his life. He gave the order to retreat. All ships were to jump to hyperspace immediately. The fleet would scatter and regroup at the fallback position. It was the smart tactical decision. It was the right choice for preserving what remained of his forces. But it felt like swallowing poison. His helmsman engaged the hyperspace drive. Nothing happened. The ship stayed exactly where it was. The helmsman tried again with the same result. He turned to Zarnoth with panic in his eyes and said the drive would not engage. Something was preventing the jump. All across what remained of the Kresh fleet, the same thing was happening. Ships tried to flee and found they could not. Their hyperspace drive simply would not activate. Zarnoth realized with dawning horror that the humans had somehow blocked hyperspace transitions. They had anticipated the retreat and cut off the escape route before it could be used. Captain Susan Blake watched from the Ranger as Kresh ships tried and failed to jump away. The interdiction field was working perfectly. It was one of humanity's newest weapons, a network of specialized generators that created a bubble of disrupted space where hyperspace travel was impossible. Any ship that wanted to leave had to first get outside the bubble. But the humans had positioned their interdiction ships carefully. The bubble covered the entire battle zone. Admiral Greg Patterson's voice came through on all command channels. His orders were simple and final. The enemy had tried to run. There would be no escape. All ships were to close in and finish this. The time for surgical strikes was over. Now came the hammer blow. The final phase of the battle lasted 18 minutes. Commander Zarnoth knew his fleet was doomed, but he refused to die without fighting back. His warriors had been bred for combat across thousands of generations. If they were going to die today, they would die as their ancestors did, with weapons firing and enemies burning. He gave the order that every Kresh captain dreaded and hoped for in equal measure. Ramming speed. All ships were to pick the nearest human vessel and crash into it at maximum acceleration. If the Kresh could not escape and could not win through conventional means, then they would turn their own ships into weapons. Even a crippled battleship could destroy an enemy through collision. Mass and velocity were universal constants that no shield could fully negate. The remaining 800 Kresh vessels turned as one and charged. Their engines burned at maximum power. Damaged ships that could barely hold atmosphere became missiles aimed at human targets. It was a desperate tactic born from desperation, but it was also the most dangerous thing the Kresh could do in their current position. Captain Danny Torres saw the Kresh charge developing on his tactical display. 3 heavy cruisers were accelerating directly toward his position. They were trailing debris and leaking atmosphere, but they were still moving fast. Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez at the tactical station called out the closing speed and projected impact time. 40 seconds until collision. Danny smiled. He had been flying combat ships for 12 years and had seen every trick in the book. Ramming attacks were rare because they required a level of desperation that most species avoided. But when they happened, they could be effective if the target panicked. The key was not to panic. He gave orders to come about to heading 348 and increase speed to 0.85 light. His crew executed the commands without hesitation. The Hornets turned and accelerated directly toward the oncoming Kresh vessels. On the Kresh ships, the crews must have felt a moment of satisfaction, thinking the humans were going to meet them head-on. That satisfaction lasted exactly 3 seconds. At the last possible moment, when collision seemed absolutely certain, Danny executed a lateral roll that would have turned any unprotected crew into liquid. The ship spun like a bullet fired from a rifle. It missed the first Kresh cruiser by less than 50 meters. As the Hornets passed, Danny fired every weapon on his port side at point-blank range. The Kresh vessel, which was already damaged from earlier in the battle, simply disintegrated. Its hull could not withstand that kind of punishment at such close range. The other 2 cruisers tried to adjust their course, but Danny was already gone. His ship had changed direction again and was accelerating away. The Kresh captains found themselves chasing empty space while human railgun rounds tore through their hulls from behind. This same scene played out across the entire battlefield. Human ships accepted what looked like ramming challenges and then danced away at the last instant. The Kresh had superior mass and weapons, but the humans had superior maneuverability and coordination. Mass did not matter if you could not make contact. Weapons did not matter if you could not aim them. Captain Helen Price commanded the Falcon through a series of maneuvers that her crew would later describe as impossible. She threaded her ship between 2 Kresh destroyers that were trying to sandwich her. Her rotating habitat section kept the crew comfortable, while the ship pulled accelerations that exceeded 20 gravities. She fired as she passed, and both destroyers became expanding clouds of wreckage. In the council chamber, the assembled representatives watched in absolute silence. The tactical display showed the Kresh charge and its failure in real time. Red icons rushed forward with what seemed like suicidal determination. Blue icons danced and weaved. Red icons winked out one after another. In less than 20 minutes, the entire Kresh fleet was gone. Counselor Tresh broke the silence. Her voice was barely a whisper, but in the quiet chamber everyone heard it. She said the humans had done it. They had actually done it. The entire Kresh armada was destroyed. Speaker Velen's crystalline body had turned a shade of purple so dark it was almost black. It was a color none of the other counselors had seen before. It indicated a level of shock that bordered on system failure. He said that over 10,000 Kresh warships had been destroyed in less than 5 hours. The greatest military power in the known galaxy had been crushed by a species barely a century into space travel. Counselor Drath was already thinking about the implications. He said the council needed to revise their understanding of human capabilities immediately. They had been treating humans as primitives who barely understood the basics of space warfare. Clearly, that assessment was catastrophically wrong. Another counselor pointed out that the humans had not just won the battle. They had dominated it. Their casualty rate was less than 1%. That kind of victory was unheard of in modern warfare. Even in the most one-sided battles in galactic history, the winning side typically lost at least 10 to 15% of their forces. The humans had made the battle look easy. On board, the Dominator commander Zarnoth stood alone on his ruined bridge. All his officers were dead. Most had been killed when a human fighter had strafed the command deck with cannon fire. The ship's systems were failing. Life support was down to emergency levels. The engines were offline. Zarnoth knew he had perhaps 10 minutes before the ship lost all power, and he suffocated in the dark. He stared at the tactical display, which somehow still functioned. It showed the last moments of his fleet. Ships that had served the Dominion for generations were being torn apart by human weapons. Warriors who had conquered a dozen worlds were dying without inflicting significant casualties on their enemy. It was the greatest military disaster in Kresh history. A communication channel opened unexpectedly. A human face appeared on the display. It was an older male wearing the uniform of an Earth Defense Force admiral. His expression was neutral, showing neither triumph nor cruelty. He spoke and the translation came through clearly. Admiral Greg Patterson offered Zarnoth one chance to surrender. If he powered down his weapons and shields immediately, he and any surviving crew would be treated according to the rules of war. They would be prisoners, but they would be alive. Greg said this without emotion, as if he were discussing the weather. Zarnoth's mandibles clicked in what might have been laughter, or might have been a sob. He said the Kresh knew only victory or death. Surrender was not a concept his species understood. They had conquered for thousands of years. They had never retreated. They had never accepted defeat. How could he be the first? Greg nodded as if he had expected this answer. He said that Zarnoth had fought bravely and his warriors had shown courage. But courage was not enough against superior tactics and coordination. He said something that made Zarnoth pause. He said the Kresh had made a fundamental mistake. They assumed that technological parity meant tactical parity. That was not true. Zarnoth asked what he meant. Greg explained that both sides had similar technology. Faster than light travel, energy shields, plasma weapons. The tools were comparable, but the Kresh communicated using radio, which meant every order took seconds or minutes to reach its destination. Humans did not have that limitation. Understanding dawned on Zarnoth like a cold sun rising. He said the word slowly. Quantum entanglement communication. The humans had actually made it practical. That was how they coordinated so perfectly. That was how they moved as one. Every ship, every weapon, every fighter was connected through instantaneous communication. There was no delay, no gap. They truly did function as a single entity with many parts. Greg confirmed this and added another detail. He said the Kresh had evolved on a world with light gravity. Humans had not. Earth was a heavy gravity world that had shaped human evolution. Humans could survive accelerations that would kill Kresh warriors. Their ships were designed to exploit this advantage. He said Kresh military doctrine had developed fighting species similar to themselves. Human doctrine developed fighting other humans, and humans were the most dangerous opponents any species could face. Zarnoth understood completely now. Humans had been fighting each other for their entire history. They had perfected warfare against the most creative, vicious, and adaptable enemy imaginable. Themselves. Every trick, every tactic, every innovation had been tested against other humans, who were equally creative and equally ruthless. By the time humans reached the stars, they had already fought more wars than most species fought in millennia. Zarnoth looked around his dead bridge. He saw the bodies of officers who had served with him for years. He thought about the 10,000 ships and millions of warriors who had died today, all because the Dominion had assumed these primitives would be easy prey. He told Greg he would not surrender, but he would send a message to the Dominion. They needed to know what they were facing. They needed to understand that humanity was not prey. Greg agreed and gave him 5 minutes. Zarnoth recorded his message quickly. He detailed the battle and the human capabilities. He described the quantum communication and the incredible maneuverability. He recommended that the Dominion never engage humanity in open warfare again. To do so would be suicide. He sent the message on emergency channels that will reach Kresh space within hours. Then he turned to face the viewport. Human ships were taking positions around the Dominator. They moved with that same impossible grace. He said he was ready. The Dominator died seconds later, torn apart by concentrated fire. Zarnoth died with his ship. The last survivor of the worst defeat in Kresh history. Ambassador Kyle Harper returned to the Galactic Council chamber exactly 72 hours after the Kresh ultimatum had been delivered. The atmosphere was completely different from his last visit. Where before there had been pity and resignation, now there was cautious respect mixed with fear. Council members watched him enter with expressions that ranged from admiration to concern. Some clearly did not know how to react to what humanity had accomplished. Speaker Valen stood at the center of the chamber. His crystalline form showed colors that indicated careful diplomatic thought. He began speaking before Kyle even reached the speaking platform. He said the council had reviewed all the battle data from the Helios sector. The recordings had been analyzed by military experts from every member species. The conclusion was unanimous. Humanity possessed military capabilities far beyond what anyone had estimated. Bellin continued by saying the council was prepared to discuss humanity's membership application under completely new terms. Given what humans had demonstrated, they deserved a seat on the Security Council. This was the inner group of 5 senior species that determined military policy for the entire council. It was a position of significant power and influence. Humanity would join the most important decision-makers in known space. Kyle listened carefully. He had expected something like this. Commander Lisa Monroe stood beside him, and he could feel her presence like a steady anchor. They had discussed many possible outcomes during the flight back to council space. This offer of a Security Council seat was one they had predicted. Kyle thanked the speaker for the generous offer. He said humanity appreciated the recognition of their capabilities. But then he said something that made every being in the chamber pause. He said humans had not fought the Kresh to gain political leverage. They fought because the Kresh had threatened their people. They fought because surrender was not in their nature. They fought because it was the right thing to do. Councillor Drath moved forward through the assembled representatives. He said that regardless of human motivations, the facts remained clear. Humanity possessed overwhelming military power. Their technology and tactics could reshape the balance of power across the entire sector. The council needed to acknowledge this reality. Kyle nodded slowly. He understood the concern. A new military power had emerged seemingly from nowhere. The established order was threatened. Species that had felt safe for centuries now had to reconsider their assumptions. He said he understood their worry, but humanity had a different proposal. Lisa activated a holographic display. It showed a proposed treaty framework with details about military cooperation and technology sharing. Kyle explained that humanity did not want a Security Council seat. They did not want to dominate the council or dictate policy. Instead, they wanted to propose a mutual defense pact. He said the victory over the Kresh had been decisive, but it was not easy. Humanity lost 61 ships and over 4,000 personnel. Those were sons and daughters, mothers and fathers, friends and loved ones. Each loss hurt. If the Kresh had been better prepared, or if they had understood human capabilities before attacking the battle, might have gone very differently. Kyle continued by explaining the proposal. Humans would share certain defensive technologies with council members. Improved point defense systems, better ship designs, coordination protocols that did not require quantum communication, but could still improve fleet effectiveness. In exchange, humanity wanted access to council scientific databases. There were fields where other species were centuries ahead of human knowledge. Medical technology, advanced materials, xenobiology, things that would benefit humanity greatly. Councillor Tresh floated closer to examine the proposal. Her jellyfish form pulsed with curious colors. She said this was unusual. Most species that won a major military victory used that power to extract concessions. They demanded territory or resources or political control. Humanity was offering to strengthen everyone collectively rather than dominate individually. Lisa spoke up. She said humanity had learned hard lessons from its own history. Earth had seen countless empires rise and fall. Everyone thought they could rule through force. Everyone eventually collapsed. The pattern was clear. Alliances built on mutual benefit lasted longer and worked better than empires built on conquest. Humanity was more interested in building lasting partnerships than temporary dominance. The council members consulted among themselves. Different species used different forms of communication, creating a complex web of discussion that filled the chamber. Finally, Speaker Velen raised a crystalline hand for silence. He said the council was willing to accept the proposal in principle. However, there was one critical question. The quantum communication technology gave humans an enormous military advantage. Would humanity share that as well? Kyle shook his head firmly. He explained that quantum entanglement communication had taken 6 years of research and trillions of credits to develop. It represented a massive investment of human resources and intellectual effort. Humanity would share coordination protocols and tactical doctrines. They would teach council forces how to make better use of conventional communication, but the quantum communicators themselves would remain exclusively human technology. Counselor Drath said this meant humanity would retain a significant military advantage indefinitely. How could the Council be sure humans would not eventually use that advantage for conquest? Kyle met his multifaceted eyes directly. He said the Council could not be absolutely sure. Trust had to be earned over time through actions, not words. But he pointed out that humanity had just demonstrated their intentions. They could have made demands after their victory. They could have threatened other species. Instead, they were offering partnership. The debate continued for several hours. Various counselors raised concerns and questions. Kyle and Lisa answered each one patiently. They provided data. They offered guarantees. They showed detailed plans for how the technology sharing would work. Slowly, the Council came to agreement. The Mutual Defense Pact would move forward. Over the following weeks, the details were negotiated and finalized. Human technical advisors began arriving at Council worlds. They worked with local military forces, teaching them tactics that had proven effective against the Kresh. The coordination protocols were surprisingly simple once explained. They did not require fancy technology, just careful planning and practice. Captain Susan Blake found herself assigned to work with the Vexian Defense Fleet. She spent her DI was teaching officers who had fought the Kresh decades ago and lost. She expected resentment, but instead found eager students. One Vexian captain named Krell asked detailed questions about the rotating habitat sections in human ships. Susan explained the engineering challenges and shared the complete design specifications. Krell's engineers might find solutions that humans had missed. Similar exchanges happened across Council space. Human doctors learned about Varani cellular regeneration techniques. Human material scientists studied Tresh crystal growth methods. Human xenobiologists examined thousands of species that had never been documented on Earth. In Exchange Council, species learned about human military doctrine and ship design and tactical thinking. Admiral Greg Patterson received a promotion to Joint Commander of Council Defense Forces. He found himself working with the very beings who had once pitied humanity's chances against the Kresh. Speaker Velan told him during a strategy meeting that humanity had changed everything in 5 hours. The Kresh had been the nightmare that haunted the sector. Every species lived in fear of their fleets. Now the Kresh were requesting peace negotiations and offering reparations. Greg said that fear was a terrible foundation for peace. Real lasting peace came from mutual respect and shared interests. Valen's crystalline form pulsed with colors that indicated thoughtful agreement. He said this sounded like wisdom from a species that had survived many wars. Greg smiled and said humanity had survived thousands of wars. That experience taught them that avoiding war was better than winning it. 6 months after the battle, Ambassador Kyle Harper stood before the Council again. This time the purpose was different. Humanity's membership application was being put to a final vote. Every species would vote publicly. The chamber was completely silent as Speaker Valen called for the decision. One by one, the councilors voted in favor of human membership. Counselor Drath voted yes. Counselor Tresh voted yes. Every single representative voted to accept humanity into the Galactic Council. It was the first unanimous membership vote in Council history. No species had ever been accepted with complete agreement before. Valen presented Kyle with a ceremonial data crystal. It contained the complete history and charter of the Galactic Council. By accepting it, Kyle formally brought humanity into the community of spacefaring civilizations. He held the crystal and thought about the long journey that had brought them here. From a species that could barely reach their own moon, to a civilization that had defeated the greatest military power in the sector. But the victory over the Kresh was not the achievement Kyle felt most proud of. The real achievement was what came after. Humanity could have used their military power to dominate. They could have become the new Kresh. Instead, they chose partnership. They chose to build rather than conquer. Kyle thanked the Council. He said humanity looked forward to contributing to the mission of peace and cooperation among the stars. The chamber erupted in various forms of applause. Different species showed approval in different ways. Some made sounds, some changed colors. Some released pleasant scents. Together it created a symphony of acceptance. Commander Lisa Monroe leaned close to Kyle and whispered a question. She asked if he thought the Council truly understood why humanity won. Kyle considered this. He said maybe they understood and maybe they did not. But it did not matter anymore. What mattered was building something better together. Out in the Helios sector, cleanup crews from multiple species worked side by side, salvaging wreckage. Human ships worked next to Vexian vessels and Varani craft. Even a few Kresh ships had joined the effort. They were part of the reparations agreement. Former enemies now worked together toward a common goal. Lieutenant Jake Sullivan flew patrol in his fighter, watching the crew's work. 6 months ago, these species had been strangers. Some had been enemies. Now they were allies. His communication panel activated with a message from one of the Kresh salvage ships. They reported an unstable reactor signature in a debris field. Could he investigate? Jake adjusted his course immediately and confirmed he was on his way. As he flew toward the designated coordinates, he smiled. This was what real victory looked like. Not the destruction of enemies, but the creation of friends. Humanity had won the war in 5 hours, but winning the peace would take much longer. And in the end, peace would matter far more than any military victory ever could.